In ancient Japan, young boys were taken from their homes, dressed in silks, and locked away in secret chambers, forced into roles as male concubines for the powerful. This hidden practice shaped the politics of courts and shoguns, yet was scrubbed from official records. We'll uncover how these boys were chosen, what they endured, and the scandal that nearly brought down a dynasty. And when you hear the final secret, you won't believe it was ever allowed to exist. Here's a question. If you could choose, would you rather live as a poor free farmer or a concubine with riches, but no freedom? Leave your answer below, and later we'll reveal why many of these boys longed for the farmer's life instead. Most history books paint Japan's imperial courts as elegant places of poetry, cherry blossoms, and refined art. But behind the paper screens lay a truth rarely acknowledged. Male concubinage was a normalized yet silenced institution. Lords, emperors, and even shoguns kept hidden chambers of young boys, some taken by force, others sold by desperate families. It wasn't considered scandalous at the time. It was power flaunted in secret. For centuries, entire generations of concubines lived and died without leaving their names in the records. That silence wasn't accidental. Historians now know it was deliberate erasure, intended to preserve a sanitized legacy. The roots of this practice trace back to the Heian period, an age famous for its aristocratic culture. Court nobles obsessed over beauty, not just of women, but of young boys whose looks were celebrated in poetry and painted scrolls. Male attendants were paraded like ornaments, chosen for soft skin and delicate features. Some were elevated to companions of princes, where the lines between servant, lover, and prisoner blurred. The court masked these arrangements as aesthetic devotion, calling it the worship of youthful beauty. But behind those words was exploitation dressed as elegance. What looked like art was often abuse, hidden under lacquer and incense. Samurai swore loyalty to bushidō, a code of honor built on discipline, bravery, and service. Yet some of the same men who died fearlessly in battle kept male concubines behind closed doors. This double life wasn't unusual, it was a feature of power. The warrior caste saw possession of young companions as both a status symbol and a display of dominance. Publicly, they preached self-control and loyalty to lord and land. Privately, they indulged in relationships that blurred lines between affection, ownership, and coercion. The contradiction was staggering. Men who demanded obedience in war also demanded submission in their homes. And while bushidō left no room for weakness, concubinage was framed as an extension of control. How were boys drawn into this hidden world? Some were kidnapped outright, snatched from villages by retainers sent on secret errands. Others were sold by families facing starvation, their futures traded for a few coins of survival. In rare cases, boys were offered as gifts to powerful lords, wrapped in silk as tokens of loyalty. Once chosen, escape was nearly impossible. Contracts weren't written. Control was sealed by fear and dependence. The selection process itself reflected the brutal hierarchy of the time. The wealthy secured amusement, while the powerless became expendable. Families often convinced themselves it was an opportunity, but the reality was far darker. These boys weren't stepping into privilege. They were stepping into a cage lined with gold. Once taken, the boys faced a brutal transformation. Their childhood identities were stripped away through rituals designed to erase defiance. Heads were shaved, clothes replaced with silks, and strict diets imposed to keep them delicate in appearance. But the real training was psychological. They were taught to speak softly, move gracefully, and never question an order. Any sign of rebellion met swift punishment, sometimes beatings, sometimes weeks of isolation. The goal was simple: break the spirit, build obedience. Some boys resisted at first, only to realize resistance brought harsher consequences. Over time, many became trapped in a cycle of fear and dependence. Their own survival depended on pleasing the master who owned them. To outsiders, life in a lord's palace looked enviable: lavish clothes, fine food, endless luxury. For concubines, though, these gifts came at the price of constant surveillance. Every movement was observed, every conversation overheard. They were never truly alone. Trust was impossible. Even fellow concubines might inform on one another to earn favor. Their days blurred into a monotony of service, their nights filled with demands they could never refuse. At times, they were paraded at banquets like prized possessions, smiling while their eyes betrayed exhaustion. To the world, they appeared privileged. But privilege without freedom is another form of imprisonment. Block 7. Physical toll. Behind the silk robes, male concubines carried bodies marked by strain. Many suffered malnutrition since food was rationed to keep them slight and youthful in appearance. Punishments for disobedience were harsh, beatings that left scars hidden beneath fine clothing. Illness spread quickly in cramped quarters, yet proper medical care was rare. Some boys were forced to serve even while sick, as if their health mattered less than their role. The weight of constant demands left them physically depleted by the time they reached adulthood. Few lasted long in service. Those who did were often discarded when their looks faded. Block 8. Psychological impact. The greater scars were invisible. Torn from family and stripped of autonomy, concubines often developed fractured identities. They lived as possessions rather than people, praised one moment and humiliated the next. Constant vigilance bred paranoia, never knowing who might betray them for favor. Trust dissolved, and many learned to suppress emotion altogether. Some clung to poetry or song as secret outlets, hiding fragments of their true selves in coded words. Others simply broke, sinking into despair so deep that survival became routine rather than life. For every concubine who played the role perfectly, countless others quietly collapsed inside. Block 9. Power games of the lords. For the lords who owned them, concubines were more than companions. They were pawns in a constant struggle for influence. A favorite concubine could whisper secrets at the right moment, tilting decisions that affected armies and estates. Rivals sometimes sought to bribe or even kidnap these boys, turning them into unwilling messengers of political sabotage. The stakes were deadly. A single rumor passed through a concubine's lips could spark a feud that cost dozens of lives. For the concubines themselves, survival meant learning to read moods, shift loyalties, and hide feelings beneath flawless masks. You might wonder, where were Japan's religious leaders in all this? Buddhism, dominant at the time, often chose silence. Some sects rationalized male concubinage as a form of aesthetic devotion, cloaked in language of beauty and spiritual closeness. Shinto traditions, meanwhile, sometimes framed it as ritual necessity, weaving obedience into divine justification. By remaining vague, religion gave lords the moral cover they craved. A boy wasn't just a possession, he was framed as part of a sacred duty. Yet scrolls and sermons rarely named the practice outright, leaving future generations unsure of whether the silence meant acceptance or shame. When a practice can't be spoken of openly, culture becomes its disguise. Male concubinage in Japan often hid behind the language of art and poetry. Haiku and waka described blossoms of fleeting youth, lines that seemed innocent until scholars realized they often referred to boys in service. Painters captured their delicate features under the guise of celebrating beauty, while kabuki actors mimicked their gestures on stage. Even letters between lords were filled with coded references, where a moonlit night meant something far darker. Culture didn't just mask the practice, it preserved it in plain sight, waiting for future readers to decode. Every secret leaks eventually. In some courts, concubine affairs spilled into gossip, sparking outrage powerful enough to destabilize entire dynasties. Lords lost credibility when jealousies turned violent, and rivals exploited the whispers to paint them as corrupt or weak. One infamous scandal involved a shogun accused of favoring a concubine over his own wife, leading to factional splits among retainers. Another tale tells of a young boy who attempted escape, only to be caught, and his punishment so brutal it triggered unrest among the servants. These scandals were rarely written in official chronicles, but diaries and foreign accounts reveal just how close they came to causing collapse. On the surface, male and female concubines lived parallel lives, chosen young, confined to luxurious chambers, and bound to their master's whims. But the double standard was staggering. Female concubines at least carried the possibility of producing heirs, a role that could secure them influence or protection. Male concubines, however, had no such leverage. Their value rested entirely on beauty, obedience, and the favor of their lord. Once that favor faded, they were more easily discarded. Some were pushed into military service, others sent back to villages with little chance of reintegration. The system didn't just exploit them, It denied them even the thin layer of security their female counterparts sometimes enjoyed. Despite the dangers, not every concubine accepted captivity in silence. A handful attempted escape, slipping through palace gardens under the cover of night. Few succeeded. Those who were caught often faced punishments so brutal they served as warnings to others. Yet their defiance planted seeds of fear in their masters. What if loyalty could never be guaranteed? Some concubines resisted in subtler ways, leaking secrets to rivals, forging alliances with servants, or embedding coded pleas for freedom into poetry. Even in chains, they found ways to remind the world they still had a voice. When European traders and missionaries first reached Japan, they were stunned by what they glimpsed behind the lacquered walls. Letters from Jesuit priests mention unnatural practices in noble households, though they used vague language to avoid offending patrons. Some merchants whispered about boys dressed in women's silks, serving wine with eyes cast down. These accounts were dismissed back home as exaggerations or misunderstandings of exotic customs. Yet their consistency suggests otherwise. Foreign observers couldn't grasp how such practices were tolerated in a society famed for order and honor. Their writings, scattered in archives, now serve as some of the few outside confirmations of what Japanese elites tried so hard to bury. By the Tokugawa period, the practice of male concubinage began to wane, but not vanish. Centralized rule and stricter social codes forced lords to project an image of moral discipline. Public scandal became riskier, and whispers of concubines threatened reputations. Still, in private, the system lingered. Some daimyo simply shifted their concubines further from sight, hiding them in remote estates. Others turned to coded rituals that masked the practice as artistic patronage. Gradually, though, the tide of politics, religion, and cultural shame eroded its visibility. What was once flaunted as a symbol of power became a secret liability.
But here's the twist. As the practice declined, efforts to erase it from memory grew even stronger.
When history is inconvenient, the easiest weapon is silence. As Japan modernized, chronicles that once hinted at male concubinage began to vanish. Diaries were burned, scrolls edited, and genealogies rewritten to erase traces of scandal. Some historians believe entire archives were deliberately purged, leaving only coded poems and veiled anecdotes behind. Officials knew the stigma could weaken the image of noble families, so they buried it under layers of omission. The result? A historical ghost story. Everyone senses it existed, but the evidence is fragmented and fragile. Even as records disappeared, art refused to forget. Kabuki theater, with its male actors playing female roles, often included gestures and songs that mirrored the lives of concubines. Playwrights wove double meanings into performances, where audiences in the know caught references outsiders missed. Classical poetry spoke of boys more beautiful than blossoms, lines that modern scholars now recognize as veiled testimony. These cultural fragments became the hidden archive of concubinage, preserving what official scribes destroyed. Ironically, the attempt to erase history only forced it into new forms, where it endured in metaphor and performance. Today, historians are piecing together the fragments left behind: poems, diaries, kabuki plays, and scattered foreign accounts. For centuries, scholars ignored or dismissed these references as allegory. Now, with fresh eyes, they recognize them as coded testimonies of real lives. This shift has forced Japan to confront a past that complicates its image of tradition and honor. Some argue acknowledging it tarnishes cultural heritage. Others believe silence dishonors the victims twice. Museums and researchers continue debating how openly these histories should be told, aware that cultural pride often collides with uncomfortable truths. Though the practice ended long ago, its shadow lingers. Japan's cautiousness in discussing sexuality, the coded language in literature, even certain taboos in theater, all trace threads back to the silenced lives of concubines. Families that once erased these stories passed down generations of secrecy, teaching shame as inheritance. The result is a cultural memory half remembered, half suppressed, yet still alive in subtle ways. To understand Japan's attitudes today, one must acknowledge the buried influence of this hidden system. For centuries, rumors swirled about one shogun whose downfall was tied directly to his concubines. Tokugawa Iemitsu, the third shogun of the Tokugawa dynasty, was whispered to have kept a harem of boys hidden within Edo Castle. Some chronicles accuse him of neglecting affairs of state, consumed instead by palace pleasures. When rivals discovered his secret, they weaponized it, whispering that his rule was corrupt, unfit, and guided by obsession. While the official histories softened the story, diaries of courtiers and early missionary reports preserved the scandal. Whether exaggerated or not, the whispers alone were enough to erode his authority. The story of Japan's male concubines isn't just about hidden chambers and lost records. It's about how power reshapes morality, how culture disguises cruelty, and how silence becomes a weapon stronger than swords. These boys were erased from chronicles, but their existence echoes in art, literature, and the cultural unease that lingers to this day. Their lives remind us that history isn't always written by the victors. It's often written by those who have something to hide, and the cost of that erasure is borne by the voiceless. History often hides what it finds inconvenient, but silence never erases the truth. The story of male concubines in Japan shows us how power can shape memory, how art becomes testimony when records vanish, and how even centuries later, the past still whispers through culture. Their lives may have been erased from chronicles, but not from consequence. If you found this hidden history eye-opening, stay tuned, because next time, we'll dive into another forbidden chapter of the past that schoolbooks never dared to print.